Hello everyone and welcome back to the Tata chess tournament in Wijk aan Zee, the Netherlands. The players are enjoying a rest day today, so we are going to have a look at one of the games in the earlier rounds. In this video we'll have a look at the game between Niels Grandelius and Richard Rapport. Both are very aggressive players, so it could be expected that this game was going to be very exciting. Anyway, without further ado, let's jump right in and let's have a look at what happened. So Niels opened up with e4 and Richard played c5. Knight f3 by Niels, and here black has a lot of options. Black can go d6, this usually leads to the knight or lines like the dragon, or knight c6 if he is fancying more something like a Sveshnikov. But Richard played the move e6, the third main move, and this generally leads to the Taimanov or the Khan. So let me show you real quick. So Niels played d4, take, knight c6. This is usually more referred to as the Taimanov, and this move right here, a6, is referred to as the Khan. Once again, black is keeping a very flexible setup. He's not committing his knight yet, not really showing where he wants to put both of the bishops. So a lot of players like these openings, and Richard as well. So knight c6 by Richard, knight c3 by Niels, and queen to c7. All right, and here the main moves have always been moves like bishop e3, bishop e2, just developing the pieces. But here Niels came up with a very new move, the move g4. Now this move came into fashion lately. White just wants to storm on the king side right away. Alright, so Richard goes h6, making sure that the pawn cannot advance any further. If he goes knight f6, Niels can now play something like knight db5, hitting the queen, and if the queen moves back, then g5. And this knight doesn't have anywhere good to go. It has to move back to g8, and that is obviously kind of sad. So h6 was played by Richard, bishop e3 by Niels, continuing his development, knight f6 by Richard, and f3 by Niels, strengthening the pawns on e4 and g4. Alright, so Richard goes a6. Once again, black is making all these flexible moves. He's really keeping his options open. So Niels goes queen to d2, further continuing his development, and knight to e5 by Richard. Alright, and here Niels came up with a very interesting move. He played f4, sacrificing the pawn on g4. Alright, now you might be wondering, like, why did he not just castle? Well, he can castle, but things are not that easy. Black's going to go b5, and let's say play a move like h3, right? Defending this pawn, so now we can go f4. Here black's going to go b4, and your knight is lacking any good squares. It will have to go to a4, and here black can play the move d5. And this is the advantage of not having played d6 yet, is that this pawn moves to d5 in one go. And if white is not careful, black is going to go bishop d7, and white will have to do something very ugly, like let's say king b1, bishop d7. White will have to play something like b3, but this is obviously quite terrible. I mean, look at this king, look at these pawns. So the position is quite tricky, which is why Niels played f4. Alright, and Richard played knight to c4, but the best move actually would have been bishop to b4. Now this is not easy to see during the game. I mean, you're sacrificing your knight on e5, but you take an e4. Right, so you hit the queen and you hit the knight on c3, but there's a lot of things you have to evaluate, a lot of material imbalances. First of all, white can take the knight here, and black's going to take here, white is going to have to recapture, and black takes here, and black is probably doing pretty well. I mean, he has a queen against 1, 2, 3 minor pieces, but he also has 2 pawns, right? But I mean, there's a lot of things black has to evaluate. Furthermore, after knight takes c4, white could also go queen to d1, and after takes, black takes on c3 with a check on the king, and if the king moves to f2, black's going to take the rook, white recaptures. So here we have a position with another material imbalance. Black has a rook, and once again 1, 2 pawns, and white has 2 minor pieces. So generally the 2 minor pieces are better than the rook, but also look at the white king, it's a bit exposed. And after, let's say, castles followed by a quick f6, black would be doing pretty well, but once again, we don't want to criticize Richard too much because these lines are very difficult. Anyway, Richard played knight to c4, another nice move, hitting the queen and the bishop, so Niels was forced to give the bishop for the knight. Richard recaptured, and e5 by Niels, hitting the knight on f6. Alright, so Richard was like, alright, give me that pawn. And he's hitting the bishop on e3. And for Niels, he cannot just drop the bishop back, because if he does so, black is going to go something like b5, and a quick bishop b7 and the rook on h1 is in a bit of a pickle. Alright, that's why Niels just played a rook to g1, and he allowed this trade on e3. So here we have a very interesting position. We see that white has the 2 knights and black has the 2 bishops. Furthermore, black is up a pawn. So from a strategic standpoint, this is great for black. If black somehow, let's say he trades off the queens, let's say he gets completely developed, black is winning. Black is winning. But the fact is that in this moment, except for the queen, all his pieces are still on the back rank. White's pieces are pretty active. So that creates a situation in which Niels might have a dynamic advantage, but he will have to prove something very, very quickly, because otherwise Richard will stabilize the position and the long-term advantages will come into play. Anyway, so Richard goes b5. So now he can develop this bishop over here. Niels goes queenside castles, bishop b7 by Richard, king b1, always a very useful move by white, making sure that this pawn is defended, making sure your king is not in any checks, or it's always just a little bit better placed on b1 and Sicilian. And Richard goes queenside castling as well. And I think here's where Niels made quite a serious mistake. In this position, he should have played knight to b3, with the idea of going knight a5, hitting the queen, hitting the bishop. I mean, let's have goes king to b8, we go knight a5, and if the queen moves back, then we can trade, and we've removed a very important defender of the black king. Right here, white could continue with something like knight e4. White is still down a pawn, but once again, the king is a little bit airy, and we could continue with something like rook d3, rook d1, and white still has a lot of compensation. And the problem for black is that after knight b3, if black plays something like queen c7 to stop knight e5, white is going to go a4, trying to chip away at the pawns here on the queen side. And if b4, then knight e4. And we've provoked this pawn at b4, and once again, it exposes the black king just a little bit more. So this is how Niels should have continued, but instead he played knight e4 right away. So it looks quite nice with both the knights in the center, but the knights are also a little bit loose. Right? This knight is always under attack by the bishop, and it cannot really go anywhere, right? I mean, these squares are covered, and if it goes to d6, black is just going to trade the passive bishop for the knight. All right, so Richard goes king to b8, also sliding his king away from sort of any potential attacks on this half-open c-file. Niels goes rook to d3 and rook to c8 by Richard, putting his rook on the half-open file. So Niels goes rook gd1. He's bringing another piece over to the queen side, but now this bishop on f8 is free to develop, because his pawn on g7 was no longer under attack. Niels goes queen to c3, hitting the queen, and Richard slides the queen over to a4. And Niels now moves the rook back, and here things start to get very, very dangerous for Niels. Richard found a very nice move here. Bishop takes e4. Now, we talked about the long-term advantages compared to the short-term advantages. Generally, you don't want to give up your bishop for this knight here, but white has a tactical problem here. If he just decides to recapture the bishop, black has rook takes c2. And you cannot take that rook, because then your queen is hanging, and black is winning. So if you cannot take the rook, black is just taking a second pawn. And white also cannot play a move like b3, which looks great. I mean, you disconnect the queen and the rook, but suddenly there's queen takes c2, checkmate. That's too bad. All right, so Niels goes b3 first. So make sure that, hey, this queen has to step away from this fourth rank. But now Richard steps back, and after Niels recaptures, all of a sudden all these dark squares around his king are weakened. And guess what? Black has the dark squared bishop. So Richard goes rook to c7, making sure that this pawn is always defended, and now he's ready to double up the rook. f5 by Niels and rook h c8 by Richard. He's now ready to launch his own attack. Rook g3 by Niels, hitting this pawn. Now Richard comes up with another very strong move. He goes bishop a3. All right, so once again, this king is starting to feel the heat because all these dark squares around the king are weakened. White cannot take the pawn, because then comes queen to c3, and queen b2 checkmate can simply not be stopped. And this is referred to as the lobster pincer checkmate. It's always very effective if your opponent weakens these squares around their king. Anyway, so Niels goes h4, queen and b4 by Richard, just getting a little bit closer to the white king. h5 by Niels, and here Richard played rook to c3. And here Niels misses his last chance to stay in the game. In this position, he took on g7, but that did not turn out well. Instead, he should have taken on e6 first. And you might be wondering, like, okay, why should white take here? I mean, doesn't this just leave the rook on g3 hanging? Well, if black takes his rook on g3, now white is going to go e takes c7, hitting the rook. This pawn is also very far advanced. And if black goes rook to d8, there's knight to c6, checking the king, and you pick up the queen. So black cannot go into that. And if black goes something like queen c3, going for the checkmate, now white is going to take here. And the white attack comes first. Queen a check on the king, and if king c7, white can play, for example, queen a7. King has to move back, you give another check. And then you can pick up the bishop on the next move. And white's king is completely safe, so white is winning. Alright, so that is what happens if black takes the rook on g3. If black takes the rook, he's lost after pawn takes c7. Now let's have a look at what is the difference. Like, let's say black just recaptures on f6. Now here white is going to take on g7. And in the game, Richard plays rook to h3. But here white would have had rook takes d7. And white's attack just comes just one move earlier because white is threatening checkmate right here. Alright, so this was Niels' only way to stay in the game. And the game would have still been very, very complicated. But in the game, Niels captured on g7. And now came rook h3 by Richard. And suddenly this move, queen to c3, cannot be stopped. If white takes on e6 now, black's just going to go queen c3, ignore everything. And it's going to be checkmate on the next move. And once again, white simply doesn't have a way to protect this square. You cannot move your knight back, because that leaves your queen hanging. And in the game, Niels tried to move queen e1. Alright, covering the c3 square this way. But Richard came up with an amazing move in this position. He played the move rook to h1. Alright, so he's hitting the queen, and white is in trouble. If you take the rook, well, guess what? There's queen c3, and checkmate can once again not be prevented. And, okay, if you take the queen, there's rook takes d1, checkmate, because the bishop guards these squares. So there's simply nothing Niels could do. He went rook to g1, but Richard just took the rook, and after queen takes g1, queen c3, Niels threw in the title. The last thing, the towel. It's already the third time this happens. The only thing he could have tried was knight at c6, hoping for d takes c6, because this leads to a draw. Because after check here takes, white can give the perpetual, or he can actually go for more by taking the bishop. But of course, Richard would have probably just taken with the rook, and mate is still inevitable. So very nice game here by Richard. Richard is currently in shared second place with 2.5 out of 4. This game was a little bit overshadowed in the third round by the amazing win by Vidit over Daniel Dubov, but I thought this game also deserved a lot of attention. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.